Quixote is a software artificial intelligence system that tries to learn how to behave more like humans. It does this by listening to stories. What we do is we give it a whole bunch of stories about how to do very common tasks, things like going to a restaurant or picking up a prescription drug from a pharmacy. And by listening to the stories, it then tries to act or behave or learn what sorts of things it should expect from doing those stories. The reason why this is important is because in giving these stories often describe how humans do it, which really brings out the social conventions that people follow when they actually perform these behaviors. So if we want to talk about a story about going to a pharmacy, it'll include things like going to the bank, withdrawing money, using the money to pay for the prescription, standing in line, even being polite to the pharmacist. Now contrast that to many other software systems, artificial intelligence systems, where you might ask the agent to simply bring the prescription back to home. The simplest way is often to do something that is not socially acceptable, like steal, where it's just simpler and faster to do that, but that's exactly the sort of behavior that we don't want the agent to be able to do. So in that sense, by learning the social conventions, we are in fact teaching right from wrong. When Quixote listens to a story or reads in a story, it applies two primary artificial intelligence techniques. The first is story understanding. What it tries to do is it tries to look at the stories that it has and pick out the most important parts and the most important orderings. So when it sees in many different stories about, again, a pharmacy, it'll look and say, what are the things that happen most often and what ordering do they happen most often in? By doing that, it learns basically a model of how to do the task or how humans tend to do the task. From that point, the second technology is something called reinforcement learning, which is basically trial and error learning. What happens is we give Quixote a little bit of reward every time it does something that looks like the model, that looks like the stories that are read in. And we give it a little bit of punishment every time it does something that's not like in the stories. And over many, many hundreds and thousands of trial and error learning again, it starts to prefer doing certain things over other things. This is very important because often we don't have actions that are explicitly labeled stealing or not stealing or right or wrong. Quixote right now is a very simple artificial intelligence system. It takes in very simple stories and it only learns to do one thing at a time. As we progress in the research, we hope to bring this into more and more sophisticated environments, going into, say, 3D gaming computer environments, virtual worlds, before we eventually progress to real-world robotics. So the final goal is us to eventually move into robotics, which we believe is a very important endpoint because we envision a near-term future where robots have suddenly become very important to societies. We're going to see progressively more and more robots move out into the real world, and as they do that, they're going to be interacting with us on more and more social sorts of ways. So again, if we go back to the pharmacy thing, we see robots that are actually performing chores, going out and performing things out in the real world for us. Maybe they're healthcare robots who are helping us do things that we can't do because we're homebound or sick or ill. These agents, these robots, are going to rub elbows basically with other people. So it's very important that they learn the social conventions of society so that they don't cause harm. And we can think about harm in terms of violence or physical damage. That's the easiest to deal with. But there's also other types of harm. So even agents and AIs like Siri or Cortana, they can accidentally insult us. They can upset us by telling us the wrong things at the wrong times. So it's very important that they start to extract or learn the values that we have in our society that helps us interact with each other, because they're going to basically become surrogates for us in the real world. As robots and as Quixote goes out into the real world, they're going to have to be much more sophisticated when it comes to the social conventions and the values that it learns from these stories. So in the future, Quixote will go from simple stories to more complicated stories, eventually reading entire sets of stories that have been written as fiction for a culture. and then basically reverse engineering the thing that the authors, the people who are part of that society, believe are the most valuable, important things for their protagonists to exemplify.